The road was deserted, stretching out endlessly under the eerie glow of the full moon. Laura gripped the steering wheel tighter as a strange fog rolled in, obscuring the path ahead. Her friends in the back seat had fallen asleep, leaving her alone with the unsettling silence. Then she saw it, a figure standing by the side of the road, motionless, watching. She passed it, heart pounding, but only seconds later, the figure appeared again up ahead, closer this time, wearing a twisted smile that chilled her to the bone. Laura and her friends had been planning this road trip for months. The plan was simple: drive through the scenic routes, stay at quaint motels, and let the road lead them to forgotten towns and hidden wonders. It was supposed to be a fun, carefree adventure. A final getaway before they all moved on to new jobs, new cities, new lives. They'd packed snacks, loaded up playlists, and even brought along a few ghost stories to tell when the nights grew long. But nothing could have prepared them for the nightmare that was about to unfold. The first couple of days were perfect. They drove through rolling hills, forests painted in fall colors, and quaint little towns that looked like they were frozen in time. But as they ventured further from civilization, things began to feel off. It started with little things: a growing unease, an inexplicable chill in the air, and the feeling of being watched whenever they stopped to stretch their legs on deserted roads. One night, as they drove down a particularly empty stretch of road, a dense fog began to settle. It crept over the car like a living thing, swallowing the light from their headlights and wrapping them in a strange, muffled silence. The GPS lost signal, and even though Laura swore they'd been on the same highway, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were going in circles. "I feel like we've seen this place before," said Mike, peering out the window. His voice sounded small, barely audible in the thick fog. "Relax, it's just the fog messing with us," Laura replied, though she didn't believe her own words. She felt the prickle of fear crawling up her spine. They pressed on, hoping to find a motel or even a gas station to ask for directions. But the road remained empty, a desolate stretch winding through dense woods that seemed to close in tighter the further they drove. After what felt like hours, they saw a figure on the side of the road, a woman dressed in an old-fashioned dress, her face hidden by a dark shawl. She stood motionless, her head tilted as though she was listening to something they couldn't hear. Should we stop?" Sarah asked from the back seat, her voice shaking. "No way," said Ben, the final member of their group. "She's probably just some hitchhiker, but something doesn't feel right about her." Reluctantly, they drove past the woman. But as they rounded a corner, Laura's breath caught in her throat. The woman was there again, standing on the side of the road, even though they hadn't passed any other cars or turns. "How is that possible?" Laura whispered, panic tightening her voice. They drove faster, but no matter how far they went, the woman kept appearing. Every time they saw her, she was closer, her head tilting more sharply, her face still obscured by the shawl. At one point, Laura swore she saw her smile, a sick, knowing smile that seemed to say she was toying with them, enjoying their growing terror. "Maybe we should turn back," Sarah suggested, her voice barely a whisper. Laura nodded and slowed down, but the moment she tried to make a U-turn, the engine sputtered and died. She twisted the key frantically, but the car wouldn't start. They were stranded, swallowed by fog, with nothing but the dark, twisted forest surrounding them. "Great, just great," Ben snapped, his bravado quickly fading. "Now what?" They debated waiting in the car until morning, but the fog made it impossible to tell how close dawn was. Then they heard it, a soft, scraping sound like someone dragging their nails along the side of the car. It started at the rear, growing louder as it moved toward the front. Sarah covered her mouth to stifle a scream, and Mike's face drained of all color as he clutched Laura's hand. Laura dared to look out the window and froze. The woman was right there, her face pressed against the glass, her eyes hidden in shadow but her mouth twisted into a grotesque, hungry grin. She whispered something they couldn't hear, her cold breath fogging up the window. Without warning, she vanished, leaving only the faint impression of her face on the glass. Shaken, the group scrambled out of the car, desperate to put distance between themselves and the terrifying vision. But the fog had grown thicker, and no matter which direction they walked, the road twisted and turned, leading them back to the car every time. "We're trapped," Mike whispered, his voice breaking. "This isn't possible." Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes. It was hard to tell in the suffocating fog. The only constant was the feeling of being watched, the occasional glimpse of the woman in the shadows, and that soft, unrelenting whisper that seemed to follow them wherever they went. Then they heard a sound, faint but unmistakable, the hum of an approaching car. They shouted and waved, desperate for help. The car slowed, but as it drew closer, their relief turned to horror. Behind the wheel was the woman, her dark shawl framing her hollow, empty eyes. She stared straight ahead, not acknowledging them, as though they weren't even there. As the car passed them, they realized with a sickening jolt that it was their own car. Inside, they could see their own terrified reflections staring back, frozen in horror, mouths open in silent screams. The fog thickened, and the car vanished down the road, taking their doppelgangers with it. Left alone in the silent, empty fog, the friends knew with a sinking certainty that they would never leave this place. They were trapped, lost on a road that seemed to stretch into infinity, haunted by their own reflections, doomed to walk in circles as the fog swallowed them whole. In the years that followed, drivers passing through that stretch of road would sometimes report seeing strange shadows in the fog, faces pressed against their windows, or hearing faint whispers that sounded suspiciously like desperate pleas for help. But by the time they reached the other side, the fog would clear, leaving them to wonder if it had all just been their imagination, or if something darker and far more terrifying lurked within the foggy, endless highway.